Now, you might be wondering, as a primarily Sony videographer, why in the world do I have this camera? But let me explain. This isn't going to be your typical review. Like I've said it before, I am not a photographer, and I'm not even a Fuji shooter. Actually, this is my very first ever Fuji camera. But stick with me and maybe I can explain what exactly I'm doing with this camera in the first place. You see, with as much hype that's been around this camera, I'm almost embarrassed to say that I have one. But that same hype around the camera is the entire reason that I've even considered getting one. You see, this camera, and well, the internet, has a way of making you want it. And realizing that my pre-order with B&H that it placed the day after pre-orders went live is going nowhere, and I was probably looking at sometime in a midsummer delivery, I started browsing eBay and trying to find one on the used market. I saw one listed just above MSRP, and honestly, it was a fantastic deal, so I bought one immediately. So for the past 2 weeks or so, I've been carrying this camera just about everywhere and getting so many incredible shots with it. Now, I want to preface this again. I am not a photographer. I do not make money in photography. I am solely a full-time videographer professionally, and I would occasionally bust out a Sony a7 IV every now and then to take photos of my family trips. Actually, up until this purchase, I've only ever shot on Sony cameras. Now, this is a bold statement here. My Sony a7 IV takes better photos, especially when it's paired with a 35mm 1.4 from Sigma. However, the whole purpose of the X100VI series isn't to get perfect photos. It's for the compression, it's for the ease of use, and it's for the overall size, which is where the X100VI absolutely takes the cake. Now, let's first talk on film compression. Now, if you haven't seen the studio's video on this, I highly recommend checking it out. They dive deep into what exactly RAW photos are versus JPEG and how the Fujifilm's compression is just fantastic. And that's kind of what I want to talk about here. See, because I'm not a photographer, on my Sony camera, I'll take RAW photos or sometimes just JPEGs. Then I'll typically transfer those to my iPhone, and from there I'll upload them into Lightroom Mobile, where I add some lame preset that I bought online, and after that, then I export back out of Lightroom to a shareable file on my phone. See, the problem with this process is that I'm lazy, and most of the time I just want to have an artistic photo directly out of camera that I can send to my phone and send to my friends. And see, that's where the X100VI shines. The different film simulations and recipes give your image a fantastic look directly in camera, delivered via a JPEG file. I've said it once and I'll say it again. I am not a photographer. And a big part of being a photographer is knowing your editing style and how you want your images to look after the fact. And since I have no process for editing photos, the X100VI has been so much fun canceling out that step for me. Something I'm learning to love a lot more is the quick menu on the side of this camera. I'm able to load several different film recipes into the custom modes and change the custom modes depending on location. I've been loving this Kodak Gold 200 look that I found on Fuji X Weekly. However, because of the white balance calls for a daylight setting, this look struggles heavily with indoor photos. So for C2, I've set up a Kodak Ultramax 400 look that seems to have a similar look with a better white balance for indoor photos. Quickly switching between these two looks is essentially what I've been doing since receiving the camera. At first, when receiving the camera, I was kind of overwhelmed at the amount of just the different amounts of film simulations and recipes that you could create and choose from. But after talking with a friend of mine who's been a Fuji shooter and a Fuji photographer for several years, he said he typically gets 2 or 3 film simulations set for his specific needs and then never really adjusts them again. It makes complete sense because diving into the menus on day one with my Sony cameras in the past, setting up my custom buttons, and then never touching the settings ever again is exactly what I'm used to doing. So I like that you can set the custom modes, set them for different film simulations, and just roll on from there. Anyways, I'm very much liking the looks that I get out of this camera. Let's move on to what I call the ease of use. When it comes to me personally, I have a lot of cameras in my office. My A7S III is typically rigged up into this big cinema rig that you guys have seen on this channel, and my other A7S, like this one in a cage, and my A7 IV are both typically in cages ready to shoot video. What I don't have is a camera that is always photo specific and always ready to take photos. It can be such a challenge when I want to quickly grab a camera for something around the house, and going into my office, I have everything everywhere, SD cards everywhere, everything rigged up for video use, and all the cards are full of client video. With the X100VI, I found that it's always ready to go regardless of the situation. Since I typically transfer the JPEGs to my phone, there's always an SD card in the camera, and since I always charge the camera via USB-C port, there's always a battery in the camera ready to roll. I honestly haven't even looked into the idea of ever filming video on this camera because I just don't think that's what it's designed to do. For me, this camera is set up as a photography camera that is ready to take out photos and take photos at any given instant. And that's what I pretty much love about it. Honestly, when debating this camera, I was looking into purchasing an A7C II or an A7CR, but the more I thought about it, the more I would try to attempt to have those as B and C cameras for my professional work, and they would definitely impede on the ease of use and always having a photo camera available for my family. So for me, this is the first camera purchase I've ever made that isn't designed to make money. And I think that's completely okay. This camera is solely for fun. And being a Fuji when my typical workflow is Sony means that it's so much easier to keep as a fun camera instead of putting it to work anytime soon. Furthermore, when it comes to the ease of use, I've decided to bypass the top dial altogether and route my ISO and shutter speed to these front and back dials. I know, I'm sorry. I tried my hardest to use the cool dial on the top, but I found that I shot with this camera one-handed most of the time, and bringing another hand around to adjust the top dial was just something I wasn't used to. However, being able to map these to the front and back dials just to my liking adds to the ease of use of this camera. I'll also say I really enjoy the X app from Fuji. Being able to open the app and immediately connect the camera and download my photos to my phone is much easier than the send to smartphone option from the Sony Creators app. I touched on the Q button earlier, but having specific settings in the custom modes in the quick menus made for changing scenes that just changes scenes much easier. It's a big plus on that Q button with the menu setup. And lastly, when it comes to the ease of use, and one of the biggest reasons I even attempted to look at this camera is that built-in internal ND filter. This is fantastic, and one day all cameras will hopefully have this feature. I love being able to map the ND filter to this front button, and as soon as I go from indoor to outdoor, I can just simply click on the ND filter and fire away. With the Sony's electronic shutter, I was able to set a shutter speed of 1/8000 and still shoot at 1.4 outdoors. However, I've really enjoyed the bokeh that I get out of the X100VI having that leaf shutter with the ND filter. So the 1/4000 is just a limitation we'll have to work with, but it's easy to do with the built-in ND filter. And of course, that means no more screwing on and screwing off external ND filters on the outside of the lenses. And lastly, let's just talk about the overall size and how this compares to what I'm used to out of a typical Sony camera. For a little while now, I've been shooting more photos on my Sony a7 IV. I don't have the a7 IV now, but I do have this a7S that is the exact same size of my a7 IV I'm typically used to shooting photos on. It has a 35mm 1.4 lens. It's great. I know how to use this camera, but bringing it places in public, I sometimes feel like a total douchebag. It's big, the lens is serious, and when you see a camera like this in the wild, it just screams, hey, this guy's a professional, watch out. But carrying around an X100VI, I often get the opposite approach. It feels more like a dad camera, you know? When I'm out with the family, it's less like I'm a professional taking professional photos, and a lot of this reasoning has to do with the size of the lens and just the overall footprint of the X100VI. I do wish it was just a smidge smaller, and it kind of fits into some of your loose pockets, but sometimes I'll be able to kind of tightly fit it in my back pocket, and it's still kind of tight. But eventually I want to get some sort of leather case for the camera, mainly just to help with minimizing scratches when traveling around and placing it down places. When looking at the top-down version of these two cameras side by side, you can see that the X100VI and the Sony a7 IV with the 35mm lens, the overall size is pretty much the reason I enjoy carrying this camera around. I mean, just take a look at this difference right here. Maybe you can see it better on my shirt, but golly. I know they make smaller lenses for the Sony cameras, but there's that. And like I said in the intro of this video, this camera is so hype. People everywhere want one. And I've had multiple offers to buy this camera from me already just after posting pictures on Instagram with it. So I'm a little embarrassed that I, which not a photographer at all, have one of the most desired cameras available. But I think people want this camera for the exact same reasons that I want this camera. It's a fantastic family camera to have as a point and shoot to capture the fun around you. I wouldn't shoot professional things with this, and I definitely wouldn't shoot video with this. And I wouldn't go into a professional shoot with a fixed lens like this. But for a camera that's fun to keep around the house, to capture family photos, easy and not intimidating to carry around, and it produces phenomenal JPEG images ready to share, I am so excited for my future with this camera and the memories that I'll be able to capture with it. I've already enjoyed so much having it around my family and just being able to take photos of my son and my wife and my little family and our kind of life that we're building here. So I am extremely excited to just have this thing in my pocket and see where it takes me for the next couple of years. So that's all for today's video. If you've learned anything at all, I would appreciate the subscribe. We're on a mission here to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. And it's a big goal, but with your help, I think we can do it. So I'll catch you guys on the next video, and hopefully more X100VI content to come. Thank you. See ya.